don't we go ahead and get started, I suppose. So I'll be host today. Mod said he's on the road. So perhaps we can first start off with spending a couple minutes giving some updates on the Beanstalk Farms front. So Silo Chat, are you cool with talking about what's going on in your world for a minute or two?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Guy, and happy holidays to everyone. Another sort of big week of engineering stuff on the farm. Lots of stuff in flight. So we've spent a lot of time over the last couple weeks, as mentioned, working with Halborn to really nail down how we want to structure some of the code base and document some of the code base moving forward, and have gotten some really good had a couple really good sessions with them and gotten some good feedback. So we're now beginning to take that take that learning and apply it across the rest of the code base. So documenting the field is next up, in particular on that front. So I don't know if those here have seen some of the PRs on that front that are currently open, but those are visible on GitHub. So go check them out if you're interested. In addition, as a part of our sort of gearing up to launch a bunch of new things in the new year, Wells, amongst others, we're starting to think a little bit about some of the structure for the different repositories that Beanstalk Farms pushes code-wise and how those all interact. From a development standpoint, it's been a really interesting challenge to manage a number of different pieces of infrastructure that are getting deployed at different times and need to be resilient. For example, keeping the subgraph and the UI in sync and in sync with the protocol has been a challenge. So Alex, who I don't think is here now, but he's one of our sort of more recent engineering ads on the Beanstalk Farms team. He's going to be taking care of some upgrades on that front, which will hopefully help us move a lot faster in terms of rolling those different sort of pieces of tech out, as well as keeping them more safe and secure as we do that. So a lot of sort of infrastructure things this month, as mentioned previously, but generally just continuing to move forward there. I think materially there's been some work in the SDK over the last couple of days related to basically making a deposit router so you can start with any number of tokens and end up depositing in the silo. So that work's been done. And then some stuff going on in the UI related to the pod market currently, which will probably be the next material update for the Beanstalk UI. So yeah, I'll pause there.
Thanks, Chad. Perhaps to spend a minute or two talking about some of the proposals that were shared yesterday that are in the draft and discussion period. So BIP-31 is the Beanstalk Farms budget proposal for Q1 of next year, and BIP-32 is the implementation of Seraph into Beanstalk. So perhaps to give a little bit of an overview on both of those. The intention of Seraph is, at the moment, Beanstalk governance is entirely off-chain, and you can imagine that there are situations where, or let me rewind a little bit. So the intention behind Seraph is to have a notary of sorts from Halborn, essentially check various things for different protected functions that are called in Beanstalk. And so in particular, the intention is to have Seraph protect most of the owner functions in Beanstalk. So, just to name a couple, things like whitelist token, de-whitelist token, in particular diamond cut, which is the one that can add, remove, and change functions within Beanstalk. And so the idea is to have a third party like Seraph do a bunch of verification upon the execution of that call. And so you can imagine, one thing in particular that's not getting checked on chain in advance of a proposal is that the proposer wallet has enough stock in order to propose a BIP. So you can imagine that would be the sorts of things that Seraph would check, along with some more, security focused checks, like checking that, the stock supply in a BIP wasn't manipulated by a flash loan, things like that. So would love to see some discussion in that channel, particularly as it pertains to, how the DAO can think about mitigating any censorship risks as it pertains to implementing Seraph. So that's a quick overview on that front. And then on the BIP-31 front, the budget this time around proposes to mint 750,000 beans for Beanstalk Farm's operating budget in Q1. The previous quarter proposed to mint 1 million beans, and I think at this point we'll probably have around 400,000 left over. So a slight decrease on that front, but if you check out the proposal, it also proposes to mint 250,000 beans to cover various audit work in the future, whether that's on the Halborn retainer front or setting up audit competitions through programs like Code Arena. I think that adding processes like those to the Halborn retainer agreement as well would be good to get as many white hat eyes on Beanstalk code before it's deployed. Mixolydian dropped some thoughts in the Barnyard chat yesterday that perhaps we can discuss on this call, but I'll pause there and maybe we can make the rounds first before we discuss that. Although I just realized it looks like Sweet Red Beans mentioned they had a doctor's appointment, so perhaps I can briefly read their update they dropped in the chat. So they mentioned always feel free to ping them questions. Still working on the UX for the Pod Market V2. The scope of this UX work has expanded into designing a generalized charting UI, which will be able to support arbitrary assets, whether it's pods, 1155s, etc. They mentioned that the work will likely extend into late Q1, but expecting to have a full prototype ready by the beginning of January. Among other things, like the ability to add claiming withdrawn assets to arbitrary transactions in the UI, etc. So I'll leave it to them to expand on that perhaps in the next DAO meeting. Publius, did you have any updates in particular that you wanted to give today?
On this end, super excited about, the work that's been coming along specifically with Tractor. Hoping to have that ready for audit probably within a week, or as soon as the next audit stream opens up. And, have a draft of an RFC that, really excited to looking for, to share with the community soon. So, look forward, watch out for that coming soon. On the
Could you talk a little bit about what Tractor is?
Sure, happy to. So, one of the most recent pieces of technology pushed into the Beanstalk ecosystem was Pipeline and Depot. Pipeline and Depot allow for, kind of arbitrary transactions to be executed from an account. And these arbitrary transactions can perform any number of on-chain actions, or function calls to generic smart contracts. Tractor takes this a step further by allowing Pipeline to use assets and perform actions on behalf of multiple accounts within the same transaction. What this provides is kind of a extremely generalized, abstracted, peer-to-peer transaction marketplace where one market participant can create what's called a blueprint, which is a sort of order that can perform any number of specified on-chain actions. Blueprints also can use call data provided by a second party that actually executes the order or blueprint. Now, what this allows for is the ability to create orders that can be the exchange of any on-chain assets or actions, limited only by the imagination of, kind of the UI and the client. So to some degree, it's loosely based off Seaport, but generalized to the point where, Seaport only supports transferring of, ERC20, ERC21, and ERC1125 assets between parties. This is extremely limited when it comes to engaging in contracts like opening a future, performing some peer-to-peer bet, or kind of some on-chain rate swap, or any contract that multiple parties will want to engage with in a peer-to-peer fashion. Tractor takes all, supports everything C supports and more, in the fact that it's able to leverage pipeline to perform, these generalized on-chain function calls. So ultimately, what Tractor provides is the ability for off-chain order books to be created that that support, pretty much any kind of peer-to-peer exchange or peer-to-peer agreement on-chain. So, very simple use cases of this are, an NFT marketplace, an order book for unripe bean deposits, a pod marketplace kind of V3 that allows multiple orders to be created on the same pool of assets, a pod marketplace V3 that allows orders to be created using deposits instead of circulating beans. Kind of the ability to create some kind of order book to borrow or lend beans from, certain parties, etc. So, overall, there's a lot of middleware technology that needs to be built on top of this, to create that off-chain order book and indexer solution, as well as, creating UIs for each of these individual markets that Tractor supports. But think in general, this is a very fundamental piece of code that, it's great to have in a state where, it's ready for, kind of final security checks before being deployed on chain. And, it's something that has kind of been in the works for a while. So super excited about kind of the project overall.
Awesome. Thanks for all the context. And it sounds like this would be a standalone contract similar to the relationship Beanstalk has with Pipeline.
More similar to the relationship Beanstalk has with Depot. To some degree, it could be considered an extension of Depot. But ultimately, what will likely happen is, initially some standalone Tractor or, Depot 1.1 contract will be deployed that supports Tractor. And, with the idea that at some point, maybe Tractor Facet will be proposed to be added to Beanstalk at its core layer, to provide for, gas efficient actions. I guess another thing that's important to note with Tractor is it, through kind of, its immense generalization, it also supports automated farming. What this means is farmers will be able to create functions or be able to create orders that basically pay someone to plant on their behalf every time they have a certain amount of earned beans, or, pay someone to mow on their behalf every time they have a certain amount of grown stock, or pay someone to convert on their behalf every time the bean price is below a certain price, or pay someone to sow on their behalf every time there's soil or the weather is above some number. So, Tractor was honestly initially created with the intention for automated farming, and, that's where the name Tractor came from. But during the process, it became quite clear that Tractor was capable of far more than just that, which is extremely exciting.
Awesome. Well, thank you for running through all that. Not sure if you had anything else you wanted to give an update on, but that was great.
Do you want to briefly talk about how that process that you described on potentially the best way to deploy Tractor, first as a standalone immutable contract and then eventually as an upgrade to Beanstalk as a facet, and how that may make sense as a precedent for how to deploy some of this new tech going forward?
Happy to. In general, one thing that's kind of, Beanstalk was ultimately or originally deployed using EIP-2535, which is this multi-facet proxy implementation, which allows a single contract to have infinite functionality. EIP 2535 is an extremely exciting, innovative, and thought-provoking proposal. But, kind of as Beanstalk has experimented with the diamond, over the past, a bit more than a year, it's become quite clear that, there are obvious trade-offs to this, this unlimited functionality single contract. And the most important of which is security. Beanstalk has had numerous emergency BIPs over the past couple months. Obviously, there was the exploit earlier this year, and it's becoming clear that perhaps the best path forward is not a single monolithic contract that holds all functionality and, more importantly, all of the assets of all of the different modules that's a part of Beanstalk. Every time a BIP is executed on chain and functionality is added or removed to Beanstalk, this functionality might introduce new bugs at the protocol layer, but even more notably, puts all of the assets that are in Beanstalk at risk. Now, this means that modules like the silo, which have been deployed on mainnet for at least a few months now, has been interacted with by probably at least several hundred different accounts, depositing money, withdrawing money, and it's one could consider the silo relatively battle tested at this point. Now, something we saw like in the case of BIP-28, where the pod marketplace was updated to V2 and backwards compatibility was not properly accounted for V1 orders, resulting in the ability for existing V1 orders to withdraw more funds from Beanstalk than were initially deposited into the order. And kind of what this allowed for was for funds not just to be stolen from other orders, but from any tokens within Beanstalk, including the silo. So the silo, a module of Beanstalk that's been deployed for several months and is battle tested, as stated, now is at risk due to an upgrade in another module, being the marketplace. Monolithic smart contracts, such as Beanstalk, are extremely vulnerable to this type of, exploit. And, thus, kind of it's, upon discussions with, other developers in the Beanstalk community and, just general discussions in, when architecting new products, it's become clear that, perhaps, different modularized smart contracts that can be deployed as permissionless, unupgradable pieces of software might be a better path forward than continuing to, upgrading the monolithic Beanstalk diamond, especially when it comes to pieces of functionality that aren't necessarily, related to the core functionality of Beanstalk as a protocol. For instance, something like Wells. Wells is, a decentralized on-chain, liquidity order book. And, Beanstalk as a decentralized, credit-based stablecoin protocol does not, it has nothing to do with, a decentralized exchange in its core functionality other than it needs to use that as an oracle. And thus, it begs the question, should the Wells be implemented as a part of the monolithic Beanstalk, which implies that all of the assets that are stored in Wells would now be stored in Beanstalk, and upgrading the Beanstalk protocol to include this new module puts all of the existing assets in Beanstalk at risk versus deploying Wells as separate independent contracts that are permissionless and unupgradable, each storing the tokens in their own individual contract, such that the most damage an exploit could do would be to steal all of the tokens that have been, deposited into that specific well, rather than every token that has been deposited into Beanstalk in general. It should be noted that there are advantages to the monolithic contract, most notably gas efficiency and easier middleware and UI implementations. It still kind of, collectively think, the Beanstalk community has a lot of work to do in kind of, experimenting with, developing, and, brainstorming around the best way to deploy code in the safest manner on chain. However, think the rollout with Pipeline was incredibly successful and a great proof of concept to this, deploy the functionality on chain as permissionless code, and if applicable, potentially add a facet later down the road that resembles that permissionless piece of code. For instance, depot facet is for instance, the depot standalone contract it inherits both the token support facet and the depot facet that were added in BIP-30. So the functionality that was added in BIP-30 had already been deployed on chain for several weeks, and therefore, by the time BIP-30 got around to being proposed, there were several weeks of real on-chain battle testing that had already occurred, making, adding more, assurances that, the facets being added were properly secure. So, in general, this, as discussed plenty of times in, these DAO meetings, security is of utmost importance to Beanstalk, and, in one of the, if not the largest risks to the protocol in general. And, happy to discuss and, enjoy engaging in discussions around security in general. So, that's kind of the thoughts, kind of some of the thinking that has gone into development over the past month or two, and look forward to engaging in more stimulating conversation with the community as it relates to on-chain development.
Thanks for running through all that, Publius, and anyone should feel free to unmute and speak up and ask questions. One question on my end is, I was curious if is it fair to say that one of the trade-offs would be, for example, if Wells V1 is deployed as a standalone immutable contract, that once a future Wells 2 or something like that is deployed, that liquidity is more likely to be fragmented, whereas if Wells V1 is implemented as facets in Beanstalk, the BIP that implements Wells V2 could migrate liquidity?
This is true, Guy. That being said, one option, and this is a feature that is currently in discussion for being included in Wells, is the ability to deploy Wells as upgradable smart contracts, such that if there was a well that the Beanstalk community was interested in deploying as an upgradable well, such that it could be upgraded to a V2 later down the road, that would be possible. However, an alternative to that would be, fast forward a couple months down the road, this stock gauge system is in full force, and there's a V1 beneath well, has some amount of liquidity, it has some stock gauge, stockholders are, earning, grown stock on top of that, on top of their LP deposits, and then Wells V2 gets released. A new V2 beneath well is deployed, implying that the initial one was deployed as unupgradable. One would imagine that the stock, that stockholders would start to shift their gauge vote towards this beneath V2 well as it becomes clear that it is, secure, on-chain, battle-tested code, and alongside the migration of stock vote to the beneath well, liquidity would slowly kind of migrate over as efficient, as is efficient. So, think yes, that, auto migration is a luxury that comes with upgradable smart contracts. However, it's important to take it all in the context of, good on-chain security. And, the question should be asked whether, Bean ETH, V1 well LPers, even want to migrate to V2. Say there's some voting governance structure such that all LP token holders get, one vote, and 52% of them vote to upgrade the well to V1. Now that other 49% is forced to have their liquidity migrated to a V2 well, where in a system where the V2 well is, the V1 well is not upgradable and a separate V2 well is deployed, it becomes an option for when and if V1 Bean ETH LPers migrate their liquidity to V2. Kind of by deploying, by performing upgrades through new contract deployments rather than upgrading existing contracts. One could argue that allows even more customizability and optionality for farmers.
Got it. Makes a ton of sense. Yeah, definitely interesting to consider how it would play with the stock gauge system, where you could just let the market decide and have individual participants decide on their own to migrate their own liquidity or not.
And then you layer something like Tractor on top of it. You can imagine it actually working pretty efficiently.
Definitely. I'll pause for a moment or two to see if other folks want to chime in. Great. I guess I'll check. Publius, was there anything else you wanted to talk about today?
Not on this end. Defer to the other Publii.
Over here, nothing in particular, other than continuing to work on the end of year piece, which the more we spend time on it, the more the scope continues to increase. So I feel like now the end of the year may be a little bit of a tight deadline, but continue to spend most of our brain power on that document, and hoping that really provides a lot of substance to talk about in the new year. So hoping to start a variety of different meaningful conversations that probably need to be had, and it's hard to articulate properly. So trying to just spend the time to do that.
Awesome. Thanks for the update. Mr. Manifold mentioned in the chat that they weren't able to make it, so I'll quickly try to paraphrase their update. So they mentioned working through another version of the root token, which chicken bonds, the root markets, etc. are potentially downstream of. More updates to come here once the code is ready. They said working through potential fiat crypto on-ramp options for the Beanstalk ecosystem. Space has been in flux for the past 6 months given market turmoil, but confident we have found solid partners with integrations ready sometime in Q1. They also mentioned that this is their last quarter at Beansprout. They appreciate the DAO and hope for continued success. Decentralized building has many challenges, but truly believe the group we've got here is competent and capable to keep pushing through. Thanks for the update, Mr. Manifold. Obviously, unfortunate that they won't be spending time on Beansprout moving forward, but the amount of value they added to the Beanstalk ecosystem over the last 6 months has been immense, and I'm sure dedicating their full attention to Root will bear fruits, if you will. All right, I'll go ahead and pause for 30 seconds or so, see if other Beanstalk Farms contributors want to discuss what they're working on, any community members want to chime in, ask questions, talk about what they're working on, etc.
Hey, Guy, do you hear me all right?
Yep, I can hear you, Sync.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I figured I would chime in since I didn't hear anybody else. Just a quick update. Again, thank you, everybody that considered and voted for BOP2 that passed last weekend. Really appreciate the feedback, and we'll just echo again that decentralized governance is something that we're all learning about. And I'll actually share a really interesting blog post that was posted by one of the early contributors to Coinbase on the topic of decentralized governance, just to kind of let you all kind of take a look at that. So as far as BOP2 is concerned, I've seen some community members have questions about that, just to kind of, give a pre-holiday update on that. The Hats Finance team has, they're going to be adding some, they're tweaking the contract per the approved BOP. So they're going to be merging the updates to the main contract by early next week. Aside from that, shout out to the Bean Pod for interviewing Hats Finance, and just want to extend my appreciation to them and to Beanstalk Farms for enabling that. So we'll be, once that podcast gets posted, we'll be sharing that on Twitter. And once hopefully the new year comes around and everybody's schedules are opened up, we'll have more updates. So just wanted to kind of give that update so the community kind of knows where we stand on things.
Thanks, Sync. So I know Mixolydian left a message in the chat, which I, want to make sure it doesn't go unaddressed. My preference would be to not paraphrase and read the whole thing, but it is quite long. And I dropped a few paragraphs in the budget BIP channel in response where they shared the same message, but perhaps we can briefly talk about it. I think so they surfaced some concerns about the budget BIP, and Mixolydian, if you're listening to this later and you don't think this is an accurate paraphrase, feel free to call me out on it. But I think there's two main things that I take away as the argument. One of which is that the DAO shouldn't necessarily be paying for work in advance, and that all compensation for any work done should be upon the commitment of a BIP. So I presume as the proposer award, if you will. So I guess just to briefly share a couple thoughts on that front. I think I think in theory that sounds nice, and perhaps I guess there are a couple different things I'd comment on. One with regards to, I guess, the quote unquote stability of folks working on the BIPs, whether that's at the contract level or folks working on the UI, the documentation, etc. I think that there's probably a handful of folks you could convince to work under a compensation structure like that, where there is nothing guaranteed until the code is committed. Probably the folks that were working on Beanstalk for free over the summer, but think that as it pertains to attracting a meaningful volume of quality talent to working on Beanstalk, I think that's a tougher sell or value proposition, if you will. And then on the other front, from my perspective, don't think that all of the work surrounding a BIP is necessarily done by the time that a BIP is committed. So, just to give a specific example, BIP-29 was committed perhaps like a month or a month and a half ago. Red Beans have been grinding on the designs for a new pod market UI, which, as far as engineering goes, is likely to take months after the fact. And that's if hopefully that can be improved if we have a budget that passes and we can hire more front-end devs. But those are my 2 cents on the matter. Curious if anyone else has any thoughts or wants to chime in.
Have some pretty strong thoughts here, which on the one hand, it's hard not to, on the day of, what was it, a $1.65 trillion budget approved by Congress, it's hard not to think that this is a really important conversation to be had, because God forbid the Beanstalk money printer somehow gets corrupted into paying for all sorts of shit, let's call it, to put it nicely. And to some extent, the only way to prevent that from happening, assuming that Beanstalk is successful, is to figure out an alignment between funding of projects in the Beanstalk ecosystem by the Beanstalk DAO and how to align that. So this is a very important thing to ultimately figure. And solution, or the DAO solution to these, or this continuous problem, may and likely should continue to change over time. Now, historically, and I think this conversation needs to be looked at in the context of the data that we have so far in Beanstalk's history. It's almost impossible, at least from our perspective, it's impossible to argue that Beanstalk would be anywhere close to where it is today in terms of on-chain capabilities, off-chain capabilities, level of decentralization, without the creation and funding of both Beanstalk Farms and Beansprout and on the one hand, both of those organizations have had structures within them that allow for, in theory, lots of different projects to be funded by those organizations. But then also there are the ability to distribute funds as sort of those organizations see fit. And the real question that needs to get answered is it okay that's being posed in this case, is it okay for there to be any centralization in terms of funding, or should everything happen on an individual contributor level or an individual project basis? And whereas things have certainly been set up such that if a group of contributors or an individual contributor wants to get paid on a project by project basis, that's within the realm of possibility. At the same time, it's really important to acknowledge that producing really highly sophisticated, composable pieces of technology that involve multiple layers of the stack are ultimately almost never implemented by a single person. And if the goal is really to have decentralized development, really unlikely to be developed by a single party. And in the case of Beanstalk, if you look at something like the Root Paradox launch, there was a lot of coordination between Paradox, a company that has nothing to do with Beanstalk, Root, a separate company that was incubated by Beansprout, but now is a separate organization, and Beanstalk Farms, to ultimately get a variety of different pieces of technology live in time and in a safe fashion. And the real goal, and again, at some point in the future, things may be much more stable where only doing grants of certain things may make sense. But if the goal is to have more decentralized development, I feel like if anything, there should be more funding of different organizations that are complementary to and somewhat orthogonal to Beanstalk Farms and Beansprout. And the goal is not to limit the capabilities of any one particular organization, but introduce competition between the organizations, right? So instead of handcuffing contributors or groups of contributors in any way, which seems like a suboptimal solution, the goal should be to introduce competition and incentives and options such that in the long run, the best outcomes are achieved by Beanstalk as a whole. And in short, that will require more funding, not less funding, and more willingness from the DAO to fund projects and organizations, not less. And in particular, if the threshold to raise, if the threshold to fund any particular project is raised so much so beyond just a quarterly BIP for each organization, that then those organizations can pay for things with much lower thresholds than 50% quorum for stock, feel like realistically it's very hard to imagine that Beanstalk will will actually be able to fund in a continuous fashion any sort of intricate, sophisticated, multifaceted, decentralized development. And so to that point, and I think one of the points that I don't want to get the name wrong, Mixolydian said was that minting these beans depegs Beanstalk. And to some extent, that's absolutely true. In fact, it is true. Right now, beans are a large amount of the sell pressure in beans is coming from contributors who are getting paid in beans, and there aren't that many other beans. So this is a very fair criticism of the current situation. But at the same time, it is really important to, again, zoom out and look at the history of Beanstalk and recognize that Beanstalk has minted millions and millions of beans in its history to fund Beanstalk farms and Bean Sprout, and has done so when the prices, when Delta B has been positive and when it's been negative, and to some extent to affect the larger macro, I hate to even call it strategy, because in the context of a DAO, there isn't necessarily a strategy, but the context of really sacrificing any sort of ability to coordinate at the macro level in the spirit of saving money doesn't really seem to be in line with the economics of Beanstalk, where fundamentally it can mint an infinite amount of beans. And so, again, at the risk of making an argument for where we started this conversation or this answer, which is that the goal is not to allow for the money printer to get corrupted in such a way where Beanstalk is just minting beans to pay for all sorts of crap. By the same token, particularly in its early stages, it is really important to acknowledge that as long as every bean that is being minted by Beanstalk to fund anything ultimately creates more demand for beans than it does supply of beans at the margin. So net demand, let's call it, for beans, as long as it creates net demand for beans, it's probably money well spent by the DAO. And so to some extent, there is an open question as to how to prevent that from over time scaling to massive amounts that ultimately degrade the quality of beans as a currency, but particularly in the short term where there's clearly a lot of work to be done to get to a point where all of this tech exists and runs itself and doesn't need any development, even if that's very far away. That's something worth working towards and realistic to work towards. At the same time, it's really important to acknowledge we're not really anywhere close to that collectively. And the tech that needs to get built isn't currently being built. And the value to Beanstalk of expediting the building of that tech is probably way more significant by orders of magnitude than the current cost of that development. Let's say over the next 2 years, Beanstalk spends 10 million beans on development prior to the next bull market. The idea is that, then I'm throwing out a number, but if we run the current budget for 2 years, it's like, well, it's pretty close to that. The idea is Beanstalk should, if that money's well spent, and that's one of the reasons why the 2 year, there's no 2 year budgets being proposed. These are quarterly budgets, so there's constant check-ins. At least from our perspective, in 2 years, there should be enough tech built such that DeFi can actually happen to some extent, and real economic activity can be facilitated on trustless primitives, such that the next bull market is not based on exclusively leverage and speculation, but instead some real economic activity. And if we zoom out even further, this really is like the make it or break it question for Beanstalk, which is Beanstalk has demonstrated very clearly an ability to grow and an ability to grow quickly. The real question is there a point at which the demand for beans shifts from being speculative to utility based? And that is very clearly something that is within the interest of the DAO to expedite as much as possible and prioritize the amount of demand for beans that is utility based as opposed to speculation based. And to say it again, the tech is not there to actually use beans. And therefore, almost by definition, all of the demand for beans currently is speculative. And so there is some aspect of, well, of course, Beanstalk should be willing to have downside volatility in the bean price in the interest of long-term sustainability. That's how the system is designed in the first place. So this is probably another instance of that. And therefore, from our perspective, the question becomes, assuming that there is money that can be well spent and there are things to spend it on, then the question becomes how to create processes and procedures, and permissionless ones, permissionless processes and procedures, say that 10 times fast, such that anyone or any group of people who have the ability and the will to make meaningful contributions to Beanstalk are able to do so and get funded by the DAO. And on the one hand, it's true that there are lots of other ways to get projects funded, but it's probably, particularly given market conditions, it's probably not unreasonable to expect Beanstalk to be in the driver's seat or have its own destiny in its hands, so to say. Although a lot of metaphor there, given that Beanstalk is a piece of software that exists in the metaverse. But nonetheless, it's really important to acknowledge Beanstalk has the opportunity, and if you look at the situation that it's in, more likely the obligation to fund a lot of this tech that needs to be built. So hopefully this is helpful color on why a lot of the structure is the way it is currently. And this is something that, while we currently don't have much involvement in terms of the microstructure between Beanstalk Farms and Beansprout today, it's certainly something that we did involve ourselves heavily in when they were initially created, because of how important it is that anyone that wants to contribute to Beanstalk can, and feel like the current setup is good but not great. And again, the way it could probably be greater is if there were more groups doing separate things. But again, that would require more funding from the DAO, not less.
Agreed, and particularly on the front of having more groups working on Beanstalk, with regards to, or speaking to some of the, friction there's been over the last couple months of community members asking Beanstalk Farms contributors, why is it that you're spending time working on X, or why is it that you're not spending time working on Y? I think there's a section in the budget BIP under responsibilities that I think adequately addresses how we'll probably, address those sorts of issues moving forward. But, I think, as Publius outlined, there are already a number of ways to get paid to work on Beanstalk, and whether that means proposing to be on the Beanstalk Farms Committee, as they mentioned, proposing to mint beans to fund and form your own organization. There are a lot of options, and we need more people working on Beanstalk that can add value, and not the other direction. All right, I'll give it another 30 seconds or so, see if folks want to talk about that discussion, or if they have other topics they want to address and bring up. Otherwise, we can. I see Cthulhu unmuted.
Hello, everyone. Hopefully my microphone is working well.
Sounds great.
So I can't speak for long at the moment because I'm driving, but I just wanted to say I'm really glad with what I've just heard in terms of this discussion on prioritizing long-term growth and the importance of paying to build, and that for Beanstalk to truly succeed and grow, the infrastructure needs to be built out, and that those of us over at Irrigation, we do look forward in maybe a month or a little bit more to bringing to completion a sort of a pod pricing oracle that we would like to offer to the Beanstalk community. And of course, we'll we'll see if we can get a small community grant for that work. But even if that's not possible, we're really happy to be building on top of Beanstalk. And that's all I wanted to mention.
Thanks for the input, Cthulhu. All right. Well, if nothing else, feel free to interrupt me in our last moments if you have something to say, but perhaps we can wrap it up there then. Thanks everyone for coming.